As far as I'm concerned, this watch right here is one of the most exciting releases of the year, maybe even last couple of years. But I know a lot of you out there aren't going to agree with me, simply because it's quartz. Although you'd have a hard time knowing it just by looking at it. As this second hand, just look at it right here, this second hand is smoother than most automatics out there. This is the Bulova Jet Star, which is part of their high accuracy Precisionist line. And I was so excited when I heard that this watch even existed that I immediately ordered it. And longtime viewers probably aren't surprised I went with the crimson red version. Now, most of you out there probably don't remember this, but one of my very first videos I did, in fact, I think it was the very first watch I ever bought just to do a review on, but that video was on a Precisionist. I love the movement. I love the whole idea of it. In fact, that watch has influenced a lot of my collecting by not only showing me that there are more than just cheap quartz watches out there, but also by introducing me to the world of high accuracy quartz. So I loved the whole idea of it, but that watch was just way too big. And in fact, that's the problem with the whole Precisionist line as a whole. Their watches are huge. Every one I've looked at was at least 45 millimeters. So I always told myself that if Bulova ever comes out with a reasonably sized, normalish looking Precisionist, that I'd be all over it. Well, it's taken them 5 years from that point, but they finally did it. For this one, Bulova finally wised up and went with a 40mm case. Although my calipers say it's just under that, while lug to lug is a short 45mm, thanks to its cushiony design. And with that shorter 45mm, it's gonna wear smaller. So fear not, my slimmer wristed friends, this one should fit you fine. Unlike every other Precisionist out there. The total thickness here is 12.8, which does sound a bit thick for a quartz. But remember, this isn't just any quartz movement, and that's also with a screwed down case back and a nice domed sapphire crystal. Water resistance is a mildly disappointing 50 meters. Now, I would have preferred 100, and especially on a sports watch. But with 50, this wouldn't necessarily be my first choice if I was going to spend the whole day in the water. But realistically, with everything else, it should be fine. Rounding everything out, you got a standard 20mm lug width, a good weight of 145 grams on its bracelet, give or take a link or two, and it's using their NM50 movement. More on that in a second. Before we get much further, I need to give you a little bit of a disclaimer or heads up that you're going to see some fingerprints and smudges here. Because this one isn't just a fingerprint magnet, it's a fingerprint factory. I swear, I was wiping this thing down constantly between shots. Yet later on, when reviewing the footage, they're still there. And particularly on the polished mid-links of the bracelet. Part of me wanted to reshoot a lot of this, but I remembered that my role here isn't to make the watch look extra pretty or to sell it to you. That my real job here is to present my real-world experiences with it. And with this one, this is pretty real world. It's something you're going to run into as well. So we're just going to roll with it. This is a watch where the movement is just as important as the design. And it's really the combination of the two that makes this one so interesting. So we might as well just start talking about the movement. In the world of watches, high accuracy quartz watches are pretty uncommon. These are watches that are far more accurate than your typical quartz. And there are only a handful of companies that make them. In that very small list, Bulova's Precisionist line, which was introduced back in 2010, is standout for two major reasons. The first thing is the pricing. Most of the Precisionists start well under $1,000, with the Jet Star here in particular having an MSRP of $595. We'll talk more about that later. Whereas with most other high accuracy watches, they're going to start around $2,000. There are also a few other exceptions to that, like Longines had their VHP line, but I think they've recently discontinued it. And there are a handful of Tissot's and Certinas that are also using ETA Percadrive or Persadrive movement, but those are ones that aren't quite as well known. However, the other reason, and potentially the more interesting reason to watch enthusiasts, is a secondhand. As far as I know, every other high accuracy watch out there is going to have your standard quartz tick, once per second. Whereas the Precisionist is smooth. I think it's around 16 ticks per second, and that's smoother than most automatics out there. Which, to be fair here, is a little bit of a novelty. You don't need that smooth tick to be accurate. But I gotta admit, I love looking at it all the same, and I don't think I'm gonna be alone in that. Now, that's the simple version, and that's the two major things to know about it. However, as someone who's had one before and who's been interested in them for years, I do have a couple of comments and concerns about their movements, which I also want to point out. And the funny thing is that all of them really boil down to Bulova, which is now owned by Citizen, not being quite as open or straightforward with the details of these movements. You may have noticed that I didn't mention anything about how accurate this is before, and that's because that's one of my concerns, which you might think is strange when you're talking about a high accuracy quartz watch. Now, a normal quartz watch is going to gain or lose about 15 to 20 seconds a month, whereas most high accuracy quartz watches are going to be within 10 seconds a year, sometimes even less. Whereas with the Precisionist, there is a little bit of a question about it. You see, way back when they first came out, Bulova was advertising that they'd be accurate to 10 seconds a year. That was for a few years, and then they kind of went quiet about the specifics, and more recently they've been saying it's within 5 seconds a month. Which is still good, still more accurate, and over the month I've had this one, it's only gained 1/10 of a second. So personally, I have no worries about it. But there's still some confusions and questions as to what happened. And along the same lines, there's some questions and confusion on whether the Precisionist line as a whole should actually be considered as part of the high accuracy quartz family. And not just because of the whole 5 seconds a month thing, but how they're actually achieving it. You see, every high accuracy movement is designed a little differently. With Bulova, they're using a higher grade quartz crystal, which has been cut to have 3 prongs instead of 2. And they've also jacked up the operating frequency 8 times the normal to 262 kilohertz. Which, by the way, does lead to a rather power-hungry movement, especially with that smooth sweep. I don't have the specifics with this particular one, but in general, they're going to last 2 to 3 years and use a bigger battery than your typical quartz. Now, that's what we do know. The one thing that's in question here is whether or not Bulova is using any form of thermoregulation, which is a big word, but it's also typical with other high accuracy movements, as by keeping the crystal temperature stable, you avoid fluctuations in accuracy over time. Now, Bulova seems to suggest that they are using some form of it, or at least with this one, because in the description it does mention a quote increased resistance to temperature changes. Yet I've also seen others online who are far more knowledgeable about movements than I am question whether they are, or if they have in the past. So there are some questions here, and I don't have any answers for it. But I'd love to see Bulova or Citizen just go into detail about what they're doing here, especially after a decade. As well as I'd love a page on their website to go into detail as to what the differences are between their various movements, as that's another source of confusion, as the Precisionist line isn't their only 262 kHz movements. They have others that they used to call UHF, ultra high frequency movements. The most well known of that would be the Lunar Pilot. Now, we know those don't have the same smooth sweep as the Precisionist, and they are supposed to be more accurate than regular quartz. But are they as accurate as a Precisionist? There seems to be a lot of confusion over that, and I've even seen it in comments on the channel. Some say yes, some say no, sometimes people are quoting the old specs for the older Precisionists. Bottom line, it'd just be great to have an official word on that. Now, while those are questions that I personally have, I gotta admit that in the grand scheme of things, they don't really matter as long as this watch does what they say it does. And the Precisionists do. They wind up giving you a watch with the convenience you'd expect from quartz. It's just here, it comes with a high level of accuracy and a mesmerizing second hand. Which is why I was so excited to actually see them put it in a reasonably sized watch for once. And one that's a bit more normal in style than your typical Precisionist. Keyword there is more normal. I mean, this is a refresh of a watch Bulova made in the 70s. But if you go on their website and check out what the other Precisionists look like, you'll know what I mean. As you might expect with a 70s retro watch, the case design here is a bit funky. But I was actually surprised how much I liked it in the long run. It's actually a huge departure from the original, and I think that's a good thing, as the original had this really rounded turtle-looking design. And these days, I think that would look way too much like a Seiko. So the changes here help give it its own solid identity. Although, while the design may be updated, to me it still has this retro sci-fi feel to it. Kind of like something out of the original Battlestar Galactica, where the base has these sharp angles that are then mixed with the flowing curves of the bezel and the crystals that rise out of it. There's a clear contrast in geometry here, yet it's one that still has a flow to it. and one that matches the overall 70s style and the dial design. As domed as this crystal is, it's also unfortunately likely to catch a bit of stray light and glare, which is going to be evident in some of these shots. But the majority of the time, the dial comes through brilliantly. And while the top of the watch is all polish and flash, refer to that whole fingerprint factory comment, I still appreciate that they brush the sides of it. Because in my own experiences, the sides would usually get all scratched up over time, and a brushed finish helps minimize that, as well as add some needed balance, making this more of a casual sports watch than just a really funky can you dig it dress watch. So you wind up with a case that has a lot of presence, and surprisingly so in such a compact 40 by 45 millimeter package. But I think it's one that can keep on trucking. Although the bottom of the bracelet with its polished mid-links, that may be a different story when it comes to durability. I've already got a few micro scratches on mine, which makes me wish that they really would have added a hardened coating here. I know Citizen occasionally does it, but I'm not sure if that's something they usually do with the Bulova brand. And that presence here is very important to note, because this is not a subtle watch, and that's even before you get to the gorgeous style. So realize that this is one that wants to be noticed, and in a lot of ways deserves to. Now, over at the right, you have a signed crown with Bulova's tuning fork logo. It's not screwed down, but at 50 meters of water resistance, would you really expect it to be? Visually, I think the crown looks great with the case, staying quite in proportion, but it is a little bit small to grab and use. However, since this is quartz, and high accuracy at that, unless you're traveling with it, you'll only use that crown twice a year at daylight savings. And if they ever get rid of that, maybe not even then. On the flip side, you have a standard screw down case back, which is good to see because eventually you'll be replacing those batteries. And after the whole Hamilton Indy review, I'm glad to see that at least one company understands that. Now, one of the biggest issues that the Jet Star has to face is its lack of normal colorways. And I have no idea what Bulova was thinking here. In the US, there are 3 listed, and arguably this red version may be the most normal, as it and this gold one are the 2 regular editions, while the silver, white, and blue is a limited edition. And personally, I think it's got way too much going on, at least for me. So as you can see, there's no standard blue or standard black dials anywhere. However, over in the UK, they also have an additional black dial gilded version, which does seem more normal and actually looks pretty sharp. But that one, for whatever reason, seems to be a UK exclusive. No clue, it doesn't make any sense to me. So hopefully Bulova didn't set themselves up for failure here. That said, as a fan of red watches, it's not a big problem for me. Even if there was a standard blue or black dial, I probably still would have went with this one. And I would have made the right choice because I absolutely love this style. Which also surprised me a little, just like the case. It reminds me a little of the Orient Neo 70s I looked at a while ago, but that one never seemed to grab me like this one has. And perhaps some of that does have to do with the dial color, because this dial is gorgeous. It's this deep, striking, almost magenta color with a sunburst effect. As well as there's a fume gradient which fades to black as you get to the very outer edge, which works brilliantly with the red stripes on the indices and the hands. It's not the best contrast in the world, but there's enough here that it works. And that red striping itself is just really interesting. It's taken from the original, and I'm not sure how typical it was back in the 70s, but this is the first time I've seen it. And it gives the Jet Star a very intriguing and unusual look compared to today's watches. Another thing I really like is this polished angled edge on the indices, all of them except the bigger bars at the cardinal points. And maybe it's just my OCD talking here, but I love these small design touches. For me, it's all these little things that add up to a great watch. And these angles here catch the light as the watch moves around, helping the indices stand out a little, as well as those edges seem to guide your eyes right towards the center, which is then further reinforced by the larger cardinal points, creating a subtle yet effective crosshair. Moving past the indices, you hit this slim black raised platform, which is complete with minute markers as well as lume dots, which to me is very 70s, as well as not very effective, which is also very 70s. But I do like the minute markers here, not just because it makes the watch easier to read and set, but because I think it helps with the whole sports watch look. Without them, again, it'd look a little too much like a weird dress watch. Plus, the raised platform with the Lume dots help add a little bit more depth to go along with the indices. And then there's the text on the dial. At the top, you have a simple Bulova, but down below that, you have the Precisionist logo and the 262 kilohertz. It's simple and straightforward if you know what those mean, and I do like that it's not a huge block of text. Now, there are a few negatives here I also want to point out, specifically the hands. Again, I do like the whole red stripe design here. It's not one that offers the best amount of contrast, except for the second hand. It's kind of strange to say that a white second hand is a bold choice, but here it clearly stands out from the red dial. And that's exactly what you want with this movement. There's no point in having that amazing sweep if you can't see it. The bigger problem here is that the hands are far too short. The hour hand is okay, but I think the minute hand should extend to the edge of the chapter ring, while the second hand should glide over it. And while this isn't necessarily a negative, I think it's interesting to see that the second hand doesn't have the typical Precisionist counterweight. And maybe that's because it's a refresh of an older design, or maybe because it's a smaller watch, where that counterweight would just get in the way too much. Then there's the date at the right. It looks well done, and I think the white date wheel is very easy to read, so very functional. But from a style standpoint, I think a color-matched date wheel would have looked better here. However, you've probably already noticed the biggest negative of all, which is that on some of the indices, that nice little red stripe isn't done very well. There's some clear issues on some of these indices, which, to be clear here, I can't actually see with the naked eye. At wrist length, it looks perfect. It wasn't until I pulled up these macro shots that I noticed there was a problem. Now, obviously I wish this was perfect, and it is pretty disappointing to see. This is on that whole once you see it, you can't unsee it level. Yet, as a reviewer, I do have to question if demanding macro level perfection is fair or even realistic at times. And at this price point, I don't think it is. I think at over $500, you really want to start seeing it. But I'm not necessarily going to hold it against this one like I would if it was a $1,000 or $2,000 watch. I just don't think it's fair or, again, realistic. Now, you may have a different opinion on this, and if you do, let me know down below. That's why I always show this stuff in as much detail as I can, just so you can make your own call on it. But overall, I really like this design. It's a gorgeous looking watch, and I'm pretty happy with it. As for the Lume, well, all you gotta do is look at the dial to know it's not gonna be good, as all you have for Lume are these tiny dots at the very outer edge, as well as a thin strip down each hand, which winds up fading out just before a Vostok Amphibia. So it's good for probably 10 minutes when you walk into a dark room, but don't expect more than that. Moving on to the bracelet, and here we've already talked about the fingerprint issue. It's a good looking bracelet, but I'm also not entirely sure what to call it. Is it a 3-link H-link, a split H-link? I don't know. Now it is a bit flashy, but we are talking about a 70s style watch, and it is in keeping with that. More importantly, it's a pretty well made bracelet. And I was actually surprised to see that the solid end links are quick release. I always like seeing quick release end links, and it's great when microbrands do it, but I'm actually surprised to see a big name brand do it. Hopefully they keep doing it and tell Citizen to do it as well. And for better or worse, it also utilizes a butterfly clasp. Now again, I think this is fitting with the style. And I think it's one of the better butterfly clasps I've run across. It's got a good mechanism, and it's relatively thin and unobtrusive on the bottom of my wrist. And there are half links to help you get a good fit. But even then, I know a lot of you would still prefer a regular clasp, so it just sort of is what it is here. And in the worst case, you can always take it off, thanks to those quick release end links. And after that, you can see how much of a strap monster it is. Although, I gotta say that on my 7¼ inch wrist, and even in the Texas summer heat, I never had a problem wearing it. It was actually quite comfortable, and especially with the shorter fully articulating links. Combine that with the shorter lug to lug, and you got a watch that's easy to wear throughout the day with a massive presence. Now, over the years, I've had plenty of people tell me they'd never buy a red watch because it doesn't fit their style, or that they wouldn't wear it just because it's too bold, too loud. And those were things I thought about before I bought my first red watch as well. But since then, I've gotten a few more. And these days, evidently, I just don't care anymore. Because it doesn't matter what I'm wearing, I'll wear one. I just like the way they look. Besides, a little splash of color is never a bad thing. In terms of the price, MSRP here is $595. But one thing to keep in mind is that that is MSRP. And even on a brand new watch, you shouldn't pay it. There are already some authorized dealers offering discounts. And even on Bulova's site where I bought this one, just by having it in my cart for a while, they sent me a discount as well. So the longer this one's out, the more the discounts will flow. And that's not even taking into account the gray market. When they hit there, prices are going to drop even further. So hard to judge where these things are going to wind up. And that also makes it hard to talk about the value. Although with regard to that, you also got to point out that there's nothing else quite like this out there. While there are some other high accuracy watches in this price range, none of them are going to have this sweep. Then put that in this mid-sized case, and you have something rather unique now in the world of watches. Bottom line, I like it and I'm pretty happy with it. But while I like the design, and especially the red dial, I know it's not something everyone else can dig. But if you do dig it, and you're okay with a little bit of 70s style, it's definitely worth checking out. It's not perfect, no watch is. But it is a reasonably priced, well-made, gorgeous-looking design, combined with a highly accurate and mesmerizing movement. And for me, I think the positives far outweigh the negatives here. Over the last month, this has probably been my most worn watch. It's been sitting on my desk next to a few nicer autos, yet I just keep grabbing it over and over again, mostly because it's already set and ready to roll. Yet after a month of this, I've realized that this is one of those quartz watches that spoil you. One that makes you start questioning if autos are really worth it. I mean, they are, but you still question it. It's a watch that under normal circumstances I think should do well. But here, I'm just kind of hoping Bulova didn't shoot themselves in the foot with the limited colorways. And that these actually wind up doing well. Just so that Bulova continues this trend by releasing more Precisionists in the size range, with more normal looking designs. Citizen bought Bulova a while ago, but other than the Lunar Pilot, they don't quite seem to know what to do with them. And this won't be the last time you'll be seeing this one. I'm definitely keeping it, and hopefully in about a year, I'll do an accuracy update, just for those that are curious. But in the meantime, what are your thoughts? The watch, the movement, the brand? Let me know. And if you've ever had any experience with the high accuracy Tissot or Certinas, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, you guys know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.